I came back from deployment, and my father asked, "Who told you where we moved?" I pulled into what should have been my family's driveway after 18 months in Syria, but the house was empty, with a for sale sign stuck in the brown grass. The windows were dark, and mail was piled up against the front door like nobody had lived there in months. My hands were shaking as I called my father's number, but it went straight to a disconnected message. Same with my mother's phone, same with my little sister Kayla's cell. The neighbor, Mrs. Delacroix, came out when she saw me sitting in my truck staring at the empty house. She looked uncomfortable, like she was seeing a ghost. "Tommy, we thought you were still overseas. Your family moved away months ago, honey. Left real sudden-like in the middle of the night. Didn't say where they were going." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes held something that looked like pity mixed with fear. I drove to my father's workplace, a security company downtown, where he'd worked night shifts for 12 years. The manager told me David Kowalski hadn't worked there since last spring and hadn't given notice, just stopped showing up one day. When I pressed for details, the manager got nervous and said they'd assumed it had something to do with family problems. He wouldn't look me in the eye when he said it. The security company's records showed Dad had been assigned to the Fremont Street office complex the night he disappeared. I drove there and walked the same route he would have taken during his rounds. The building housed law firms, financial advisors, and several businesses I didn't recognize. One office on the third floor had been recently renovated, with new locks and security cameras that seemed out of place. Military emergency contacts finally gave me an address in Billings, Montana, 3 states away from our home in Nevada. The drive took me 14 hours, and I spent every mile trying to figure out why my family would disappear without telling me. We'd talked every few weeks when communications allowed. Nothing had seemed wrong during our last conversation in January, except Dad had seemed distracted and kept asking about my unit's movements. The address led me to a small ranch house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty fields and looking like it had been built in the 1970s and never updated. My father's truck was in the driveway, but it had Montana plates now instead of Nevada ones. I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing before finally walking up to the front door. When my father opened the door, his face went completely white, like he was seeing someone back from the dead. "Tommy," he whispered, looking past me toward the road like he expected to see other cars. "Who told you where we moved?" Behind him, I could hear my mother crying, and my 18-year-old sister Kayla saying something that sounded like a prayer. The fear in his eyes was real and immediate. "Dad, what the hell is going on? Why did you leave without telling me?" I came home to an empty house. I tried to push past him into the house, but he blocked the doorway with his body. He'd lost weight since I'd seen him last, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping. His hair had gone gray at the temples, aging him years in just 18 months. "We can't be seen with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You being here could get us all killed." He kept glancing over my shoulder at the empty road, then back at me like he was calculating some terrible risk. "How did you find us? Did anyone follow you? Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" The questions came fast, desperate, like my answers might determine whether we lived or died. My mother appeared behind him, tears streaming down her face as she reached for me, then stopped herself. "Tommy, baby, we missed you so much, but you can't be here. It's not safe." She looked fragile, older, like whatever had happened to my family had broken something fundamental in her. Kayla hung back in the hallway, staring at me with eyes that held recognition, but also something like terror. I pushed past my father into the house, and he didn't fight me, just closed the door quickly and locked 3 different deadbolts. The interior was sparse, furnished with the kind of temporary furniture you'd find in a motel. None of our family photos were on the walls, none of the personal items that had filled our real home. It felt like a safe house, sterile and impersonal and wrong. "Start talking," I said, sitting down at their kitchen table without being invited. "I just spent 18 months in a war zone, and I come home to find my family has vanished. You owe me an explanation." My voice was harder than I'd intended, but the fear and confusion were turning into anger. These were the people who were supposed to be my anchor, my reason for making it home alive. Dad sat across from me, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. He'd quit smoking when I was in high school, so seeing him with one now was almost as shocking as finding them in Montana. "I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see," he said finally, "at my security job. I was doing rounds at the office complex on Fremont Street. You know, the one with the law firms and financial companies." He took a long drag before continuing. "It was around 3 in the morning, and I saw lights on in one of the offices that should have been empty. When I went to check, I found 3 men in suits standing around another man who was tied to a chair. Blood everywhere. The man in the chair was begging, saying he hadn't told anyone about some shipment or some account numbers. My mother made a small sound of distress from the living room where she'd been listening. Dad's voice got quieter. They saw me, made eye contact through the window. I ran, got to my truck, and drove straight home. Woke up your mother and told her we needed to pack everything and leave town immediately. But before we could even start packing, there was a knock at the door. "FBI," Dad continued, stubbing out his cigarette in a coffee cup. "Agent Parker and Agent Donovan. Said they'd been tracking a criminal organization and my testimony was crucial for bringing them down. Said the men I'd seen were enforcers for a group that had killed federal witnesses before and our lives were in immediate danger. They had a van waiting outside to take us to a safe location. The story felt wrong somehow, but I couldn't put my finger on why. So you've been in witness protection this whole time? Why wasn't I told? Why didn't the military know? Military personnel have protocols for family emergencies and witness protection situations. There should have been paperwork, official channels, someone keeping track of where my family had been relocated. The agent said keeping you in the dark was part of your protection, Mom said from the doorway. They said if you knew where we were, it could compromise the investigation and put everyone at risk. They said military communications could be intercepted, that these people had contacts everywhere, even in the government. Her voice had the rehearsed quality of someone repeating instructions they'd been given. Kayla finally spoke from the hallway, her voice barely audible. They made us write letters to you, Tommy, every month, but they said they couldn't send them because it would reveal our location. They kept them all in a box, said maybe someday when it was safe, you could read them. She disappeared and returned with a cardboard box filled with sealed envelopes, all addressed to my military postal address. Something about their story wasn't adding up. What agents? What investigation? Give me their contact information. I want to talk to them myself. I pulled out my phone, but Dad grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. His grip was desperate, terrified. The calluses on his hands were different now, softer, like he hadn't been working with tools or doing physical labor for months. We don't contact them directly, Dad said. They contact us. They said direct communication could be traced, could put us all in danger. There's a handler who visits us once a month, makes sure we're safe, takes care of our needs. Agent Morrison. He's the only one we're supposed to talk to about anything related to the case or our situation. I want to meet this Morrison, I said. I want answers about why my family disappeared without any official notification to my command. This whole thing feels wrong. I'd been around enough classified operations to know how legitimate witness protection worked, and this didn't fit the pattern. Too much secrecy, too little official oversight, too many things that seemed designed to isolate rather than protect. Dad looked at Mom, and she nodded reluctantly. I can call him, Dad said, pulling out a prepaid phone I'd never seen before. But Tommy, please don't do anything to jeopardize our safety. These people, what they did to that man in the office. I can't get those images out of my head. His hands were shaking again as he dialed a number from memory. The conversation was brief. Morrison, it's David. My son came home from deployment. He wants to meet with you. A long pause. Yes, he found us somehow. I don't know how. Another pause. Tomorrow? Where? Dad wrote down an address on a scrap of paper. Understood. He hung up and looked at me with eyes that held more fear than relief. He'll meet with you tomorrow afternoon at a diner on the highway, Dad said. But Tommy, please be careful what you say. Don't mention anything about inconsistencies or questions. Just let him explain the situation and accept it. I can't lose any more family members to this nightmare. The way he said it made me wonder who else we'd already lost. That night, I slept on their couch while listening to my parents whisper in their bedroom. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, frightened, like they were planning for disaster. Through the thin walls, I heard Kayla crying quietly in her room. Whatever had happened to my family, it had broken something in all of them that might never heal completely. I spent hours reading the letters Kayla had written, chronicling 8 months of isolation and fear. She wrote about missing school, missing her friends, missing normal teenage experiences. She wrote about the monthly visits from Morrison, how he asked detailed questions about their conversations, their thoughts, whether they'd been tempted to contact anyone. The letters painted a picture of psychological control disguised as protection. The next morning, Kayla cornered me in the kitchen while our parents were still sleeping. Tommy, I'm scared all the time, she whispered. We never leave this house except for groceries, and even then Mom comes with me. I can't go to school, can't have friends, can't have a normal life. The agent visits every month and asks questions about what we've talked about, who we've seen, whether we've been tempted to contact anyone from our old life. She looked around nervously before continuing. Sometimes I feel like we're not being protected. I feel like we're being watched, controlled. The agent always knows things about what we've been doing, even private conversations we've had in the house. How does he know that unless... She didn't finish the sentence, but her implication was clear. Unless they were being monitored rather than protected. Show me, I said. Kayla led me through the house, pointing out things that hadn't seemed obvious at first glance. Small holes in walls that could hide microphones. Light fixtures that had been recently installed. A cable box that wasn't connected to any television service. The house was wired for surveillance, not by the FBI but by whoever was really running this operation. I asked to see financial records, and Mom reluctantly showed me bank statements from the past 8 months. Their accounts had been systematically drained through relocation expenses, security fees, and administrative costs. Nearly $80,000 in savings and retirement funds had disappeared, leaving them completely dependent on whoever was controlling their situation. Classic financial manipulation to ensure compliance. Mom also showed me medical records from their monthly checkups with a doctor Morrison had arranged. The medications prescribed seemed unusual for their conditions, including anti-anxiety drugs and sleep aids that could affect memory and cognitive function. He said the stress of our situation required medication to keep us stable, Mom explained. but she looked uncertain about it now. The diner Morrison had chosen was a truck stop on the interstate, the kind of place where people passing through wouldn't be remembered. I arrived early and positioned myself with a view of the parking lot and the entrance. My military training had taught me to assess environments for threats, and everything about this location felt wrong for a legitimate law enforcement meeting. Morrison arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows, alone but clearly armed based on the way his jacket hung. He was maybe 40, built like someone who spent time in the gym but had gone soft around the edges. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He asked detailed questions about my unit, my deployment, my security clearance level, before explaining anything about my family's situation. "Your family witnessed something that could bring down a major criminal organization," Morrison said over coffee that he didn't touch. "The testimony your father can provide is worth millions to the right people, which makes him incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous. We've had to take extraordinary measures to keep them safe while building our case." His story matched what my parents had told me, but something felt rehearsed about it. What organization? What kind of timeline are we looking at for resolution? When can my family go back to their normal lives? These were reasonable questions that any legitimate federal agent should be able to answer, at least in general terms. Morrison's jaw tightened. "That information is classified and compartmentalized. Your father knows what he needs to know. You know what you need to know. And I know what I need to know. That's how we keep everyone alive." He leaned forward slightly. "Your deployment has been a blessing. Actually, it's kept you out of harm's way while we handled the situation. Where are you stationed next?" The question felt like a probe rather than concern. "That's classified," I said, using his own words back at him. "What I want to know is why standard witness protection protocols weren't followed. Why wasn't my command notified through proper channels? Why are my parents living in isolation instead of being relocated through the U.S. Marshal Service?" Morrison's expression darkened. "Son, you're asking questions that could get people killed. The situation your family is in requires methods that go beyond standard protocols. Sometimes protection means operating outside normal channels." He signaled the waitress for the check, effectively ending the conversation. "Trust the process. Your family is safe as long as everyone follows the rules." After Morrison left, I sat in my truck for an hour making phone calls. First to a buddy who worked military intelligence, asking him to run Morrison's name through federal databases. Then to a lawyer I knew who specialized in military family issues. Finally, to the FBI field office in Billings, asking if they had any agents working witness protection cases involving my family. The responses were troubling. Morrison didn't exist in any federal database. The FBI had no record of witness protection for anyone named Kowalski. Military intelligence had no flags on my family or any ongoing investigations that would require their relocation. Either this was so deep black that no one could acknowledge it, or something was very wrong. I also called the security company where my father had worked, asking for more details about his last night on the job. The manager was reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted they'd been paid by someone to alter their records about Dad's employment. They'd been told it was for his protection, part of a federal investigation. Someone had been covering tracks very thoroughly. That evening, I confronted my parents with what I'd learned. Dad went pale and started shaking. "Tommy, you're going to get us all killed. Morrison specifically told us never to verify his identity or the case details with outside sources. He said doing that would compromise the investigation and put us in immediate danger." "Dad, think about what you're saying," I pressed. "A legitimate federal agent would want you to verify his identity through proper channels. That's how you know he's really protecting you and not something else entirely." I showed him printouts from my research, the lack of any official record of their case or Morrison's federal employment. Mom broke down crying. I knew something was wrong, but I was so scared after what happened, I didn't want to question it. Morrison said questions would get us killed, that the only way to stay safe was to trust him completely and never contact outside help. She looked at Dad with something approaching accusation. "You said we were doing the right thing," Kayla spoke up from the doorway where she'd been listening. "Morrison made us sign papers every month, agreements about our cooperation and understanding of the risks. But when I asked to read them carefully, he said there wasn't time, and we needed to trust the process. I tried to take photos of the documents with my phone, but he always made sure I couldn't." "What exactly happened that night?" I asked. "Tell me exactly what you saw, not what you think you saw, or what Morrison told you saw." I needed to understand the original incident that had supposedly put my family in danger. The details might reveal whether the threat was real or manufactured. Dad's story began to change under questioning. The details he'd been so sure about became fuzzy. He couldn't remember the exact date, couldn't describe the men clearly, wasn't sure about the office building layout. When I pressed harder, he finally admitted that Morrison had helped him remember details during their monthly visits, filling in gaps and correcting inconsistencies. He said trauma could affect memory, Dad explained, that he needed to help me recall details accurately for the investigation. He'd show me photos and floor plans, ask leading questions until I remembered things the right way. The classic technique for implanting false memories, for creating a story that served someone else's agenda rather than reflecting reality. The truth began to emerge over the next 2 hours. Dad hadn't witnessed a murder. He'd seen something much simpler but potentially much more valuable. a late-night meeting between several men who'd been transferring large amounts of cash from vehicles into an office building. Not a crime scene, but possibly evidence of money laundering or tax evasion. They had briefcases and duffel bags full of cash, Dad recalled, his real memory surfacing as the fabricated version crumbled. I watched them for maybe 10 minutes, taking photos with my security company camera like I was supposed to do for any unusual activity. Then one of them saw me through the window and pointed. I ran because I thought I might be in trouble for spying on their business meeting. Morrison had approached them the next day, not as FBI but as someone representing the people Dad had observed. The witness protection had been a cover story to isolate my family and control the situation, while Morrison's employers figured out how much Dad had actually seen and whether he posed a threat to their operation. "We've been prisoners," Mom whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. All these months, living in fear, isolated from everyone, letting them control every aspect of our lives. And Tommy, they asked so many questions about you, about your unit, about when you'd be coming home. The pieces were clicking into place, painting a picture of systematic deception and manipulation. Dad pulled out a folder he'd hidden behind books on a shelf. Morrison made me write reports about what I remembered, what I thought about, who I might have told. But he also made me write about you, Tommy. Your deployment schedule, your unit's activities, your security clearance level. He said it was to assess risks to the family, but now, his voice trailed off as he realized how his information had been weaponized. The folder contained copies of reports Dad had been forced to write, detailing not just what he'd witnessed, but extensive information about our family's connections, finances, and backgrounds. Morrison had been building profiles on all of us, looking for leverage points and vulnerabilities. The reports showed a systematic approach to control that went far beyond simple witness manipulation. I pulled out my phone to call the real FBI, but Dad grabbed my arm. "What if you're wrong? What if Morrison is legitimate and you're about to destroy the only protection we have?" His fear was real, even if it was based on lies. Months of psychological manipulation had left him unable to distinguish between genuine protection and elaborate control. "Dad, we're going to find out together," I said, dialing the FBI field office number I'd looked up earlier. "If Morrison is legitimate, they'll confirm it and we'll apologize for the confusion. If he's not," I didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood the implications. My family had been living a lie for 8 months, controlled by criminals posing as protectors. The FBI agent I spoke with was initially skeptical, but when I explained the situation in detail, his tone changed completely. "Sir, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated fraud operation we've been tracking. Can you stay where you are and keep your family safe? We're sending agents to your location immediately, and we're going to need full statements from everyone." While we waited, I helped my family pack essential documents and personal items. Kayla showed me a journal she'd been keeping secretly, documenting Morrison's visits and the psychological pressure tactics he'd used. "I knew something was wrong when he started asking about my future plans," she wrote. "He wanted to know if I'd be interested in working for the government someday, if I understood the importance of keeping secrets." Special Agent Catherine Reeves arrived with a team of 6 agents 2 hours later. She was a 15-year veteran who specialized in organized crime and had seen similar operations before. "What's been done to your family is called protective custody fraud," she explained. "Criminal organizations use fake witness protection to control potential witnesses or victims while they decide how to handle them permanently. The investigation moved quickly once it started. Morrison's real name was Vincent Cross, and he worked for a money laundering operation that moved cash for drug cartels and human trafficking networks. The office building Dad had observed was one of dozens they used across the western United States to process illegal funds through legitimate-looking businesses. Your father stumbled onto something worth millions, Agent Reeves explained. Rather than kill him immediately, they decided to control him and his family while they assessed the threat level. The fake witness protection served multiple purposes. It isolated you from law enforcement, gave them time to study your father's knowledge, and provided cover for gradually eliminating your family if necessary. The surveillance equipment found in our family's house was sophisticated and expensive, designed to monitor every conversation and activity. Cross had been building psychological profiles of each family member, looking for weaknesses and pressure points. The medications prescribed to my parents contained mild sedatives that affected memory and decision-making, keeping them compliant and confused. The money laundering network had been operating for over a decade, using psychological manipulation and fake government protection to control dozens of families who'd witnessed their activities. Some families had been held for years before being relocated permanently, which was a euphemism for murder. Others had been gradually bled dry financially before being eliminated. They specifically targeted military families, Agent Reeves continued, because deployed service members couldn't verify their family's safety or intervene when things seemed wrong. Your early return from deployment probably saved your family's lives. They were scheduled for permanent relocation next month. The clinical term couldn't hide the reality of what had almost happened. Cross had been monitoring my deployment status through contacts in military contracting companies, waiting for me to return home so they could assess whether I posed additional risks to their operation. My military intelligence background and security clearance made me potentially valuable to them, either as an asset they could control or a threat they needed to eliminate. The raid on Morrison's operation occurred simultaneously across 6 states, rescuing 17 military families held in fake witness protection and seizing over $3 million in laundered money. The criminal network had been planning to eliminate all the families within the next few months, as their usefulness had ended and they'd become liabilities. Cross had been running this operation for 5 years, perfecting the psychological techniques needed to keep families compliant while systematically draining their resources. The fake witness protection program had generated substantial profits through the protection fees and relocation costs charged to victims, while also providing cover for money laundering activities. My family spent the next 2 weeks in actual witness protection while the investigation continued. The difference was immediate and obvious. Real federal agents who could verify their identities through official channels, regular communication with prosecutors, transparent timelines, and genuine concern for our well-being rather than control over our actions. The psychological evaluation conducted by FBI specialists revealed the extent of the damage Cross's manipulation had caused. Mom was diagnosed with complex PTSD from months of controlled isolation. Dad had developed severe anxiety and memory issues from the constant stress and medication. Kayla had lost crucial years of her adolescent development to systematic psychological abuse. During the trial preparation, we learned that Cross had been using information gathered from military families to assist in weapons smuggling and human trafficking operations. The intelligence about deployment schedules and base security protocols had been sold to criminal networks operating in conflict zones, potentially contributing to attacks on American forces overseas. During the trial, Dad testified about what he'd actually witnessed that night and the months of manipulation that followed. His testimony helped convict Vincent Cross and 14 other members of the money laundering network. Cross received a life sentence without parole for multiple murders, kidnapping, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The other families rescued from Cross's fake witness protection program testified about similar experiences: systematic financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and the gradual isolation from support systems that made resistance impossible. Several families had lost everything they owned to the scheme before being scheduled for elimination. Kayla's journal became crucial evidence in demonstrating the psychological control techniques Cross had used. Her detailed observations of his manipulation tactics helped prosecutors build a case showing the systematic nature of the abuse. "He made us believe we were lucky to be alive," she wrote, "that questioning him would get us killed, but trusting him completely was our only hope." The psychological recovery took much longer than the legal proceedings. Dad struggled with guilt over believing the deception and putting his family at risk. Mom had nightmares about the isolation and control they'd lived under. Kayla required extensive therapy to process the trauma of losing her teenage years to an elaborate lie designed to keep her family compliant. We discovered that Cross had been planning to recruit me into his organization when I returned from deployment. Documents found during the raid showed detailed psychological profiles and recruitment strategies designed to exploit my military training and security clearance. My refusal to cooperate would have triggered the permanent relocation of my entire family. The financial recovery was equally challenging. Cross's organization had stolen nearly $200,000 from our family through fake fees and fraudulent expenses. While some money was recovered through asset forfeiture, much of it had been moved offshore or spent maintaining the elaborate deception that controlled dozens of families across multiple states. 2 years later, we were finally free to live under our real names again in our hometown, but trust didn't come easily after being deceived by people who'd claimed to protect us. Every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call, every stranger who seemed too interested in our family triggered the fear response that months of psychological manipulation had embedded in all of us. The house I'd found empty when I returned from deployment had been restored and renovated while we were away, paid for with restitution from the criminal organization's seized assets. But walking through those familiar rooms felt different now, knowing how close we'd come to losing everything while I was serving my country halfway around the world. Kayla eventually graduated from high school and went to college, but she struggled with trust issues and anxiety that required ongoing therapy. She became an advocate for other victims of psychological manipulation, using her experience to help law enforcement identify similar schemes. Her journal from the fake witness protection period became a training tool for FBI agents learning to recognize these operations. The investigation into Cross's network revealed connections to similar schemes operating internationally, targeting not just American military families, but also law enforcement families in other countries. The psychological manipulation techniques had been refined over decades and shared among criminal organizations looking for ways to control potential witnesses and threats. 5 years after the ordeal ended, I married someone who understood the importance of transparency and communication after experiencing systematic deception. We were careful about sharing personal information and maintaining security protocols that protected us from potential threats while allowing us to live normal lives. Trust had to be rebuilt gradually, with actions rather than words. The letters Kayla had written to me during those 8 months of fake witness protection were eventually delivered, 5 years late, but no less meaningful. Reading them showed me how my family had maintained hope and love for each other, even while being systematically manipulated and controlled. Their resilience and determination to survive had ultimately made their rescue possible. Dad never fully recovered from the guilt of putting his family in danger, but he found purpose in working with victim advocacy groups that helped other families targeted by similar schemes. His experience provided valuable insights into how psychological manipulation worked and how victims could be helped to recognize when they were being controlled rather than protected. The broader impact of Cross's operation extended far beyond the families directly affected. The intelligence he'd sold about military deployments and base security had contributed to attacks that killed American service members overseas. The weapons and human trafficking networks he'd supported had caused immeasurable suffering in multiple countries. Justice had been served, but the consequences of his crimes would last for generations. 10 years later, when people ask me about the hardest thing I ever went through, I tell them about coming home from war to find my family had been kidnapped by criminals posing as their protectors. But I also tell them about the strength my family showed in surviving systematic psychological abuse, and about the real FBI agents who risked their lives to save 17 families from elaborate deception designed to control and ultimately destroy them. Sometimes the worst betrayals come from people who claim to offer protection, but surviving them proves what families are really capable of when they refuse to give up on each other.